Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today for our Lunchtime Devo. It is Pastor Adam here joining you today to read from the Bible and to see what God can teach us. Hope you're all doing well. And as we study today, I want to look at a story that we all know, we're all probably very familiar with, but we're going to look at it and see if we can pull some stuff from it in the current circumstances that we're in right now. And so I want to look at Mark chapter 6, and this is the story of when Jesus walked on the water out to his disciples on the boat. And there's some interesting things that we can pull out of here that may apply well to us in our situation today. So we're going to pick up in verse 45, and we'll just jump right in here, and I'll read it, and then we'll see what we can learn. So it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up to the mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake, and he was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, and because they all saw him and they were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them, and he said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. So, this is Mark's account of this story that happened, this unique situation with the disciples in their boat on the lake. And just to kind of give us some backstory here to the storm on this lake. We think about a storm on a lake, and you would think if you were on the boat on your typical lake around here, it wouldn't be that bad. Like, our lakes aren't gigantic. It wouldn't be hard to get to shore if a storm did come up, or we'd see the storm coming at least, so we'd have time to get to the shore. The uniqueness of the lake that they were on here, in the land where they were, it was surrounded by mountains. And so there's cool air up high, warm air down low where the water is. And it was not at all impossible, or it is actually pretty common, according to historians and according to people today who have visited the site and people who have studied storms, and they say that storms could roll in very quickly, mix that cool air and warm air mixes, just like we know here in the Midwest with tornadoes and whatnot, how quickly something can come up. And it would just, that weather would dive down into this bowl surrounded by mountains in this lake, and a storm would come up instantly, and it would get very, very intense, especially for a storm on a lake. They would get very, very bad. And so that's the situation that these disciples find themselves in, desperately straining in their boat on this intense storm that came up very quick at night, in the middle of the night. And so let's see what we could pull from this story. So I think maybe the first cool point that we could pull from is that Jesus sees us in our circumstance. I mean, we have to know how the disciples felt straining at the oars. First off, they're in the pitch black at night. It says they were in the fourth watch at night, which puts them very early in the morning, which is the darkest part of the night. And they were scared. It says that they were straining at the oars, they were rowing. They maybe felt a little angry at first. And the word that Mark uses here, in the Greek, it means that they were afflicted and tormented and pained in their efforts to desperately row to safely. Interestingly enough, back in Matthew, in his account of this story, in the same story of the gospel, he uses the same Greek word, and I may butcher this Greek word, but it says basanizo. And I didn't study Greek in college. Maybe my buddies who did would be able to pronounce that better. But there, he says that the boat was tossed and afflicted by the waves in Matthew. But here in Mark's gospel, it's the disciples who were afflicted at their rowing, and they were becoming as turbulent as the waves, and their inner state paralleled that of the outer circumstances that they were in. But again, like we're talking about this point, Jesus sees us in our circumstances. While that was the case for them, Jesus was on land and he saw exactly where they were. He knew exactly what was happening. Now, anybody else other than Jesus could not have helped them. We know that Jesus was 100% man, 100% God in one person. And while he was standing likely several miles away up on the mountainside away from this lake, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, he could see what they were going through, and he was there to help. And as we read, he responds. He comes down to help. I think that's probably one of the coolest parts of this story that it can be really easy to read over and not even think about, is that Jesus was able to see through the night, see through the storm, and see his disciples in their circumstance, which was dire circumstances, and was able to help them. Sometimes we go through storms and we may feel very much like the disciples felt, angry, alone. If we're going through a unique situation to ourselves, maybe in our financial situation, our family situation, health situation, no matter what it is, it tends to make us feel alone, and it tends to make us feel like there's not a single person out there that's going to understand what we're going through, or let alone be able to help us in our circumstance. But Jesus can. Jesus knows. He's been there. He sees you. He knows exactly what you're going through, and he can understand, and he can be there to help us. And that's exactly what he did here in this story. Just like the disciples would have felt alone, like no one would be able to save them and know what they were going through, Jesus could, and he did, and he came to their help. And so we can have confidence that Jesus sees us in our circumstance. The second point I want to pull from here is that Jesus transcends our circumstances. So transcend, what does that mean? So Jesus is above the circumstances that we're in. He was above the circumstance that the disciples were in. He was bigger than it. He wasn't subject to the situation they were in. Jesus' Father created the storm. I mean, he created the mountains that were around this lake. He created the lake. He knew exactly what was happening. He was completely in control of the situation. And so I thought it's just very interesting to see how this story, Jesus is not shook by any of this, and he shouldn't be. He's God. And another thing I find very intriguing about this story is that later in verse 48, he says he was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. So it says he would have passed by them. So imagine the disciples rowing fearlessly. They're straining at the oars. They're gaining very little distance for their long hours of labor, only to look on the side and see Jesus passing by. And there's lots of debate on what this could have meant. Like, was Jesus really about to pass by his disciples? I mean, they were the future of the church. And was he really just going to walk by and leave them? I don't know for certain, but I do know one reason I suspect maybe would have been to show vividly that no matter the circumstances, even so dire, a set of circumstances as a storm in the midst of a sea, the circumstances didn't affect Jesus in the least. He transcended the circumstance. He was completely above it all. The things that slowed the disciples down had no effect on him. And he wanted to show that. But I suspect that probably another reason, maybe the more likely reason that he would have passed them by, was because he wanted to wait for their request to help. He very easily could have just ran up to the boat, and then instead of walking by, and he could have jumped right in and took control of the desperate situation and the circumstances they were in, and commanded the sea and the waves to cease. And he could have easily rescued the stunned disciples, whether they wanted him to or not. But instead, he intended to walk alongside the boat and graciously wait for them to ask for help, and they cried out for help. And so, whatever Jesus' reasoning was for walking by or intending to walk by the disciples in the boat, I think it's a key point in here that the disciples cried out for help to him, and he was there ready to help them. He was at their aid no matter the situation, especially a situation like this. So our last point that we can pull out from this story as we close here this morning is that Jesus enters in with us and our circumstances. And I think that's a very important point of this story. And it's a very important point for us to drive home in the storms that we go through. The disciples were struggling. They desperately needed help. And once Jesus entered the boat, everything suddenly became calm. The storm stopped, and they quickly were at land on the other side. And the disciples didn't continue to strain at the oars and tell Jesus. They weren't like, Jesus, we got this. Jesus didn't come up to the boat and they said, hold on, wait, give us a chance. We're going to get to shore. No, they cried out to him. He responded. He came into their situation, and everything suddenly became calm. I think it's amazing and wonderful enough that Jesus consents to enter into our times of trial with us, enter into our storms with us. He certainly could have just caused the storm to cease by just commanding it to cease while sitting on a safe mountainside. I mean, Jesus was capable of anything. They had seen the miracles he had done. He had just fed the 5,000 right before this story. So he could have just stood on the mountainside and calmed the sea and watched them get across the side to the other side, and everything would have been fine. But I think it's a key important part of the story that Jesus responded to their situation. He saw them. He was above the situation. He transcended the circumstances of the storm. He came down. He entered in with them when they cried out for help, and everything became calm.